So I welcome everyone. I'm not the chair, or I should say I'm one of 3 chairs, so we chair this together. Welcome everyone. Before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. Most of us are probably on the lands of the Kulin Nation in or around Melbourne. I'm on Wanwurrung country in Melbourne's west. I acknowledge that this is and always will be Aboriginal land, and I would also like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and leaders now and in the future, and especially to those people in the audience who are from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. So welcome everyone to this webinar, the CRIS webinar, More Than Smash Fash. We thought we keep that very informal. I just start by welcoming everyone and don't want to give big introduction. I might want to, maybe I can say that we have all done work on radical left movements from very different angles, but we have all worked together. And we are very excited to present our sort of preliminary first findings from our different research approaches. You can ask questions in the Q&A, and we try to keep track of them and try to answer the questions. But I apologize on behalf of all 3 of us that we decided to give the presentations first, one after the other. First myself, then I think Julian is next, and then Sarah. And with that, I just hand it over to Julian to introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mario. And thank you for everyone for attending this afternoon. I see a lot of very familiar faces in the participation list there, and it's great to have you with us. I'm coming to you all from Sydney, as is Sarah. My name's Dr. Julian Druggen. I'm at Macquarie University in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology, where I lecture in terrorism studies. And so, although most of my research work in the past has been involved in either area studies in the Middle East or at the moment, some research projects for the US government and also for the New South Wales government on the far right, I also have a long interest in the far left, particularly considering all the weird varieties of far left terrorism and extremism that we saw through the 20th century. So I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about the offline communication strategies of the radical left in Australia at the moment, not necessarily the terrorist left, but the radical left. In particular, look at some postering and stickering strategies this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to your questions. I'll pass you over now to our wonderful PhD student, Sarah Holmes, who will tell you a bit about herself and what she's doing.
Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction. So my name's Sarah Holmes and I am a PhD student in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. I am fortunate enough to have both Mario and Julian as my supervisors, so it's been a great opportunity to work on the far left with them both. My specific research is looking into Antifa and the mobilization strategies that they use. So we'll be looking at the border left, I guess, today, and then narrowing down into the specific area of what my PhD research is focused into. I had previously done some research into Australia's counterterrorism governance and the evolution of that, and now looking more broadly at the left here in Australia. So that is my shorter introduction, and I might hand back to Mario, who can jump into it.
And who hasn't introduced himself even. So I'm Mario Kreiker from Victoria University. I'm also part of CRIS, where I lead the research stream 4 on the interplay between the radical left and the radical right. And this is also what I'm going to present about, that I didn't mention that before. But I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, CARR, that is based in London. I don't want to talk too much about myself. Maybe we just go to my my presentation, my only presentation, and then so we don't lose too much time and have more time at the end. So I'm trying to share my screen now. Is this working?
Yeah, that looks good, Mario.
Okay. So as Julian mentioned, he's going to talk about street art, and Sarah is going to focus specifically on Antifa in the online space. And my sort of introductory presentation looks more at the offline spaces. So it is about radical left movements and their offline mobilization against the far right in Victoria. Let's see if I can click on the next slide. Oh, there we go. So I'm basically presenting from like preliminary or almost final findings from an ongoing CRIS research study that has been carried out in collaboration with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue on the interplay between oppositional movements on the political fringes on the left and on the right. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue has sort of, we work together on this, but they have focused more on the online space, and I contributed obviously to that. But I had also that, I've been in the fortunate position to do ethnographic work on the online, on the offline mobilization of radical left groups. And I've spent quite a bit of time with radical left movements. And when I say radical, it's not a judgmental term, it's just a description that it's not in the center, sort of, and they often refer to themselves as radical movements quite proudly. So I would say that the far right and the radical left, they are obviously connected movements, and that's the whole point of that research, but they are not, but we reject, and I think I can speak on behalf of all three of us, that we reject those often heard claims of equivalences between both. It's a bit like I always compare to like the feminist movement versus the men's rights movement. Of course, they are connected, but we can talk about them individually without having to talk about the other. It's not the same box. So I'm going to present about my offline research, a number of interviews, formal interviews, but many, many informal interviews with radical left groups and ethnographic fieldwork in Victoria. The radical left in Victoria is very diverse, wouldn't surprise you, but I would say it's mostly defined or mostly dominated by revolutionary socialist groups. So I'm going to focus, although the themes are obviously very broad within radical left groups, but I'm going to focus especially, like all three of us, on anti-fascist mobilization and actions against the far right. Just briefly to conceptualize this a little bit and bring us on the same page, and it's a contested term, obviously, radical left or far left. There's no broadly agreed definition in the scholarship, in academia. So we work with a sort of a working definition that locates the radical left in a certain ideological space. So we're not talking about Extinction Rebellion, for example, but we talk about groups that are rooted in Marxist, socialist, or anarchist ideologies, and that pursue an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, radically egalitarian, pro-working class agenda, often with an international outlook. So that's sort of what I, in our project, what we see as the radical left. Anti-fascism is then a very important part of radical left agendas and actions linked to those principles of egalitarianism, also solidarity with the oppressed, and also connected to a perceived association between racism, fascism, and capitalism. So that's where we see anti-fascism sit within the radical left agendas. As I said, Victoria's radical left is dominated by revolutionary socialists, but there are also anarchist groups and other groups. Antifa cuts across all this. It's a bit messy, but generally speaking, most groups that I've been working with have told me that the dominant stream, sort of outlook, is revolutionary socialist. Okay, the radical left mobilization of offline. So let's trying to give a bit of an overview. Started basically in 2000. Well, it didn't start in 2015. There's a long history since the 1920s, obviously, and then ongoing with ups and downs. But there were always confrontations. When the right emerged, the left responded. So there's a bit of a reactive thing there. And when Reclaim Australia and other far-right groups emerged in the mid-2010s, there was a renewed activity focus to counter those movements. And so it's counter-mobilization, reactive in a way. One person that I spoke to said the goal is directly confronting the far right in the street and preventing them from controlling public spaces. So between 2015 and 2019, there were a series of far-right street protests in Victoria, but also elsewhere. The focus here is in Victoria. And according to the people that I spoke to, there were 20 counter-protests that were proudly described as rowdy and confrontational. But there was some sort of occasional escalation into violent clashes, situational clashes of violence at those protests. Many, not always, but often. Yes, you see one of the most, the ugliest, some of the ugliest scenes on those photos there. The key actors were initially a group called No Room for Racism, but has now become a group called Campaign Against Racism and Fascism. They're the most active ones. They are a campaign, a network of very different groups dominated by socialist, Marxist ideologies, but we also have socialist alternative and other groups involved in that. So interestingly, the public perception often throws Antifa and CARR and all kinds of anti-fascist action together. But what we found in our study in Victoria is that initially, in 2015 and 16, there was actually a strong Antifa presence within those protests, within CARR also. You see that on the left-hand side, where you see the Antifa flag that Sarah is going to talk a bit more about, I think, later. They worked hand in hand, basically. But there were internal debates within CARR, which has become the main radical left actor in that space. And due to arguments around tactics and optics, basically Antifa left that space and their influence diminished quite significantly. On the other hand, far or radical left groups tried to find new allies, progressive allies in the anti-racism and pro-refugee group spaces that may not have been socialist in their ideological outlook, but shared certain goals with them. We saw that, for example, in the St. Kilda rally in 2019, where there was also quite a significant group of non-socialists, but still left-leaning people there. So there was a glimpse of how this could look like when different social progressive groups work together. St. Kilda was basically, I would say, I mean, some people might see that differently. St. Kilda was the big end of far-right mobilization on the street. Since then, the tactics have changed because they don't have to confront far-right rallies in the streets anymore. So what they shifted towards is supporting other progressive rallies that the Black Lives Matter, for example, the Invasion Day and others. Their confrontational strategies were really, really marginal, and it didn't come from the radical left, but rather from the radical right that tried to disrupt those progressive rallies. And I want to just show you a quick video that I think explains that quite a bit. On the left-hand side, there's a quote from an online post that says that we support the Black Lives Matter movement, demand justice for Black deaths in custody and solidarity for Black Lives Matter. It is not about instigating conflict. And if someone is trying to instigate conflict from the right, refer the matter to the marshals who will de-escalate and remove the fash. So there a clear guidance for participants not to escalate, not to engage in violence. And what I'm going to show you is a footage that I took when the Proud Boys occupied the front stage of Flinders Street Station and the Invasion Day rally went there. They turned their back to the Proud Boys and chanted, just a few seconds. So you see there was no attempt to escalate that into violence. What we have seen now that the far right is not mobilizing online anymore, the image, the strategies have obviously changed. It's not on the street anymore. And Julian is going to talk about this a lot in his presentation, what we see now is something like a sticker war. It's sort of a symbolic contestation of public spaces. And what Sarah is going to talk about is that the contestation and the challenging of the far right happens now also online. I mean, it has always happened online, but now specifically through stickers and online spaces. A few last comments on the tactics. One clear argument is don't debate the far right. That's something that doesn't matter what I agree with, but that is a very firm statement in the radical left. We are not sitting down with them to try to convince them to be not fascist, as the first quote says. Challenging their access to public spaces and demoralizing them psychologically, that's what the radical left tries to do. So the big question is, what role does violence play? And I think that on the right-hand side, that black image with the four photos in there is really illustrates what the far right, the radical left is trying to do. Antifa, what mass media thinks, I point a gun. What Trump thinks I do, I point a gun. What I think I do, I point a gun and I'm violent. What I actually do is smile and do nothing. So there is even this idea that sympathizing with violence, but actually not using it or hardly ever using it in practice. Oops, sorry. So there were violent clashes at protests, and there are tendencies or small segments within the radical left that engages in what's called squadism, like actions of a small anti-fascist group that organize secretly, wear masks, and go and punch a fash, as one person said. That does exist, but it's very, very marginal. And I haven't heard about this it's more in theory, it's possible, and it might happen occasionally, but very, very rarely from what I learned or what I was told. When militant tactics are being used, they tend to be really situational and then often be rationalized as a form of self-defense against a fascist threat. One person said to me, we fight when necessary, but we are not pacifists. But he also expressed two reasons why violence is not the way to go. And that was a practical reason. It says it runs against our idea of building a mass movement. And if we are violent, we are not going to mobilize a mass movement that supports our anti-capitalist. I'm going to say a few things about this in a second. So it's counterproductive. So that's a strategic argument. But it's also an argument against violence that sits within an argument that is often referred to as prefigurative politics. So the radical left wants to act as if they have reached, so in accordance with their own moral values. And one of the key values is democracy, and a very basic idea of democracy. And one person said to me, we don't like violence at protests because it's very undemocratic. You know, out of a large group of anti-fascist protesters, one throws a brick at a cop and everyone gets pepper sprayed. They had no say and were used as a cover for the little adventure of that one person. So that's another argument that why people reject, by and large, the use of violent tactics. That's my last slide, I think. Yeah. So what is the goal then? The goal, according to what we learned, is to build a broad working class community, a broad movement, not situational, but it's a big utopian idea, having a working class based democracy and community. We exposed the radical right whilst trying to implement being anti-fascist as part of a left-wing consciousness, is what one person told me. So the key strategy is actually much bigger. And that's why where the reactionary nature is actually only one part of the description of the radical left. The key strategy is not violent confrontations, but building the forces of anti-fascism, of progressive movements that are also anti-capitalist movements. So the struggle against the far right is ideologically grounded in an anti-capitalist agenda, and it's grounded in two different ways. In one way, there are personal overlaps. So people who are anti-fascist are also, or active in anti-fascism, are most of the time also anti-capitalist, socialist, anarchists. So there's an ideological overlap. And there's the conviction that capitalism as a system brings into existence fascism. And that's why we have to fight fascism and capitalism at the same time, is what radical left would then say. Just want to end with the last quote. We can't just be reactive, but also need to be able to make an argument about how we can have a fundamentally different kind of society. And that's also that prefigurative politics that shapes the behavior of radical left movements. I hope I didn't go too long, and I stop sharing now. And pass on to Julian. Right.
Well, thanks, Mario. You didn't go long at all. That was absolutely spot on. And hopefully I won't go long either. So I've just shared my screen. Unfortunately, because of the peculiarities of my computer, I'm going to have to keep the sidebar open for this presentation. But hopefully that's not going to bother anybody unduly. What I'll be talking about is the research that we've been doing on the radical left's so-called sticker war that Mario just mentioned. And this is where stickers, posters, and other forms of what we sometimes call the ephemera of extremist groups or radical groups are used in public spaces as communication strategies. In particular, as communication strategies to contest the far right, in the case of the radical left, to promote radical left ideologies, but also ultimately we can't forget to subvert the state and to push toward this anti-capitalist sort of new utopian world that they're pushing for. And so I'm drawing on a collection of approximately 100 street posters and stickers that we collected over the past 24 months. The material was collected in Sydney's inner west and also southwest from urban street and park locations. The posters and stickers all appear to have been created by a spectrum of the radical left, not just Antifa. But one of the real difficulties of this research is knowing exactly who's responsible for particular posts, let alone their wider aims and their wider significances. As we'll see, they're very often, very rarely, I should say, signed with any real explicit ownership or statement of purpose. And a very quick word of warning, some of the art does depict violent and offensive images and words, as we'd all expect in a presentation like this. So what we've done is we've taken out the posters that advertised events such as university or union seminars or those that focused on rallies. And we focused really on the posters that are more statements of political intent. And that was the vast majority of the posters and stickers that we saw. Most of them are primarily image-based. Very few include any real detailed explanation about who created them, why they were created. Some of them have a link or a QR code, but this is not usual. To understand them, you really have to engage in a more semiotic unpacking of their iconography, look at their cultural references, even look at their symbolism and their intent. And as Mario noticed, as of 2021, really, the radical left in Australia are primarily structured around a commitment to counter mobilization to what they see as fascism. They have really focused on pushing the far right out of public spaces, but we have to remember that these spaces can be online, both on social media platforms and in other spaces online, but also offline on the street corners, the university campuses, the public space that we all inhabit and share. The most visual aspect of Antifa and the radical left was, until quite recently, their appearances at these street protests. But these protests have ceased. So this means that protesting and counter-protesting between these radical leftist groups and radical right groups has been pushed into these alternative spaces. The two most obvious are through online social media, memes and meme wars. And what we'll see is this postering actually has many similarities with meme culture and meme wars online. But also they've been pushed into these streets through this increasingly meme-like graphic art and postering that has really grown during COVID, and particularly during the recent lockdowns in Sydney and Melbourne. During the lockdowns has been one of the only areas where the left and the right can still compete offline in a visual and public manner. These posters and stickers have become an arena where the far right and the far left are able to contest public space. It's a form of information warfare. It's a battleground for the hearts and minds of the general public, for potential sympathizers and allies. But ultimately, these ideologies do undermine the state and the democratic process as we know it. And perhaps because of this, the radical left's posturing can express particularly violent imagery and sentiment, quite different to the prefigurative politics that Mario just talked about. So when we perform a thematic analysis of this material, what is it we see? What sort of themes do we see emerge? And straight away, we certainly see a spectrum of ideologies. We see a focusing on countering far-right ideology to demoralize the far-right psychologically. Explicitly anti-fascist posturing does exist, but perhaps surprisingly, it's not the most common theme that we found in our sample. Most of the explicitly anti-fascist posters were Antifa connected. Some were generally anarchistic and came out of anarchic groups of one form or another, we suppose from the symbolism. But we definitely also saw real life confrontation on the streets between the radical left and the radical right and the extreme right. We must remember, I think, that the far right are also engaged in a parallel extensive postering and stickering campaign at the moment. You know, these extended periods of lockdown have resulted in a real pivot towards postering and stickering amongst the extreme right. You know, just one quote from our mate, Thomas Sewell, who said recently in July, to quote him on the National Socialist Network page, he said, "We've gone into lockdown number 5 here in Melbourne, use this time off school and work to put up racist stickers in the streets and racist posters on the internet, you know, let's go." And that's the end of his quote. And so what we're seeing to some degree is a far left, you know, counter response and reaction to that. There's a strategy by both the radical left and the right to re-stick over and scratch off one another's material, akin, like I said before, to these meme wars that we see on social media. But whereas the group's online presences don't really overlap very much, you know, on Twitter or on Gab or something like that, on the streets they do overlap. And so both sides have opportunities to physically interact. And both sides are also remarkably similar in some of their strategies. You know, for instance, both of them have been very vocal in disputing the claims that far-right groups put razor blades under these stickers to prevent people from you know, putting them off with their fingers. You know, both sides say that's not the case, you know, for very different reasons. Both sides also have this interesting online-offline dynamic where they will post images online of their postering and their stickering, but also of their counter postering and counter stickering. Posting images of these sticker wars online really gives the groups and their battles a sense of real world physicality and activity that purely online posts, you know, never can do. And this might very much increase the legitimacy of the people online in showing that there's real world action and campaigns going on. And you can see in this slide, you know, in the middle there and on the right hand side. In the middle, you've got images of far right material that's been overlaid by far left. And in the right there, you've got images from National Socialist Network of far left material that's been overlaid by the far right. And so we get a whole series of these sorts of demonstrations on social media. But there's wider functions as well. A concern with countering far right fascism is not the whole picture. Posters and stickering serve other functions that go well beyond counter mobilization. As Mario noted, the focus on confronting fascism is only one manifestation of the radical left. Beyond this, of course, there's this ideologically grounded commitment to challenging capitalism, bringing about a new economic and political system, a utopian vision of some sort. And stickering is one area where the radical left do reveal their proactive and their ideological politics, their larger goals and their aspirations. This includes attempts to promote broader leftist, anti-capitalist and revolutionary ideas. The aim really appears to be to influence public sentiment and possibly to attract new allies, you know, new members and so on to the movements. And so in line with this sort of wider literature around the radical left, both internationally and also in Australia, we found 3 broad ideological positions represented. There was the anti-fascist theme. You know, much of the time that was done through Antifa imagery and symbolism, not all the time. There's also this more general, you can see in the middle there, Marxist theme focused on class warfare, the anti-bourgeois, anti-work, and so on. And that really then blends into this more anarchistic theme about destroying institutions, anti the system, anti-hierarchies, anti-government as well. And on the very far right, you can actually see, interestingly, there is also some language difference and diversity in Sydney, with Greek posters being put up, both anarchistic and also Antifa ones as well, in parts of southwest Sydney. Now, the irony, of course, here is that in terms of goals, these three movements are highly distinct. In the case of Marxism and anarchism, they're quite opposed, really, in their political ideology, although these movements have made attempts to align with one another and so on in the counter fascist movements of recent years. So what were some of the common themes that we found? Well, themes that were most common included anti-police, anti-government, and general anti-capitalism themes. Anti-police, or as they would say, anti-cops, is probably the largest theme we saw in our sample. For the radical left, of course, this is seen as an extension of anti-fascism, because police are either considered to be fascists, or they at least uphold a system of government that allows fascism to manifest. And you can see here the imagery. You can also see the ACAB shorthand, which is, of course, shorthand for, all cops are bastards, which is their quote. Sometimes they put that in numerical fashion, the 1312. You can see that, I think, in the golden one on the base there. And they almost seem to be copying or emulating the far right's, 1488 numbers, the 14 words and 88 representing, Hail Hitler and so on. Almost seems to be a mirror image of that iconography. If anybody wants to play the game at the end, please put into chat which one of these posters is actually a far right poster that is Anticop. One of them is, and let's see who can guess. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference between far left and far right imagery and postering, when it appears. The second largest theme and collection of posters that we saw was generally what you'd call anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois, really representing a combination of Marxist and anarchist themes. And this can be everything from anti-banker to anti-landlord, anti-bosses, anti-the wealthy and the rich, anti-work, private property, and also, of course, pro-worker, and that general call to resist, resist hierarchies, resist authority, resist the system. After that, number three, what we saw were posters that explicitly call to undermine Australian democracy as it's currently practiced, either a despair about democracy not working, or an explicit call that democracy doesn't work and it should be rejected. Here we see an anti-government theme starting to emerge much more strongly. As a whole, clearly, these posters are attempting to very much create an us versus them dynamic, to normalize positions of hostility with the outgroup, which is seen in this case, the capitalist system, the state, the police, the wealthy, those who follow the system. And this is widened to really include the government as a whole in many of these posters. And then finally, what we saw is a series of posters that you might call special issue or single issue themes. They're anti-patriarchy, environmentalist themes as well, anti-international nationalism themes are there sometimes, in addition. So beyond performing this thematic and topic analysis, what more can we say about the significance of this offline form of art and this offline form of protest and mobilization? Probably the more interesting or useful area to go to here is cultural and visual criminology. It's very valuable in making larger interpretations, as this school of analysis will look beyond the surface of images like these and try to explore the underlying dynamic force and power of visual culture. And one of the insights of visual criminology is that the symbolic power of imagery is something that the state and its agencies can never fully control, because the influence of the visual spectacle is too multidimensional. It's too symbolic. It's too almost unconscious in the way that it works. It escapes government messaging and government propaganda. And so if we look at these images through a semiotic analysis of their deeper levels of significance, including their cultural symbolism, what do we see? Well, the first thing that we see is a very strong connection with history, a connection with history, but also an appeal to in-group dynamics as well. There's a repeating attempt to link the long history of 20th century anarchism and Marxism to these campaigns in Sydney. There's a very strong element of the radical left in Australia and elsewhere, where they will define themselves through that historical struggle through the 20th century. All extremists and political movements legitimize their struggle through connection with history, of course, but the radical left do this in a more conscious, even intellectual manner, certainly than the far right would. They're very proud of their history of progressive workers' rights, of unionism, of resistance to fascism during early to mid 20th century. And you can see here, they're bringing out figures like Marx and Chomsky, who's still alive, of course, and sort of putting them forward as these heavyweight boxers, giving their statistics and saying, Karl Marx has a posse, we're here to represent him. It's militant, it's historical, it's also something that's a call to arms, against those who don't support them or who might be, within that fascist world that the far right the left is mobilizing against. Now, posters and stickers are also about connection with the in-group, about solidifying social bonds, the bonds of the members, the bonds of the recruits, the membership of the in-group. And this is really illustrated in the posting of photographs of stickers and posters online on social media. Not just the ripping off of the fascist ones and the tearing of stickers, but here trying to show to other members more widely to demonstrate the level of commitment and concrete action taken by individuals. What stickers have arrived, what stickers you've put up, where you've put them up. This is quite a common theme in leftist, radical left online communities. And this certainly demonstrates to the keyboard warriors out there that someone is taking real world action, action that is transgressive and even illegal, but has probably low costs of being caught. These are statements of commitment to the in-group and statements of affirmation of acting for the in-group. The posters also reveal to the public and also possibly to sympathizers and recruits that the group exists in the real world and that they're physically present on the streets. They're not just an online community. They're not just something that's happening there in cyberspace. They're on the same streets as you and I. These posters demarcate the territory of the groups. They advertise their presence to both potential friends, but also to foes. The act of postering itself can also offer a physical offline community building opportunity for those who are the part of the in-group. Groups like CARR that Mario mentioned before hold online donation rounds and fundraising meetings for postering. Coming together to design and create new posters is a social event that reinforces group belonging. It's fun, it's an opportunity for social gathering, it's a team building occasion. And then of course there's the actual stickering itself that can offer the excitement to those who go out there and do it, of a shared activity that carries a transgressive aura, very, relatively low significant legal, risks, but something that's a statement of action, particularly during lockdown. And lockdown and COVID are big themes that we see, over the last few months. Like all extremist groups, the radical left are using the current pandemic as a lens through which to spread their ideology, to spread their vision of the future. Being infected by COVID here is contrasted with being affected by systemic racism. All the scramble, and hoarding of toilet paper is used to illustrate, the degradation of people who are caught up within this consumerist capitalist system, that we all inhabit. But one particularly, I think, really new and interesting movement, and you can see it there on the right-hand side, is the White Rose movement. Stickers have really just started appearing in the last few weeks. This movement's named after a group that in the 1930s conducted sort of, anonymous leaflet and graffiti campaigns against the Nazi regime. And today it's been rebranded as this sort of international, decentralized and amorphous stickering campaign where people link up online to become independent free agents. They spread through links to encrypted Telegram accounts and so on, postering and images that people can print out at home on their own stickers machines that are quite cheap to buy. This represents an internationalization of the ideological landscape online, one that is neither really leftist politics specifically, but is more sort of generally anarchic and spread through Telegram and spread peer-to-peer around the world. You know, people will quite commonly go on offline now to sticker so that they, you know, can evade the censors who are online. One of the ironies, I think, now is people actually going to the offline streets to evade the censors on social media, whereas, you know, 5 or 10 years ago, it was to go online to evade the, you know, the police in the streets. There seems to be a real reversal of that move. Now, my last 2 points before I finish. First is that many of these stickers and posters are explicitly violent. They include implicit and explicit calls for violence, either against the state or against the system. They use violent words and images. And I think that's because they represent action, not destination. We don't really see the preventative politics and illustrations of utopian society that Mario talked about so much here, but we see images that suggest struggle and the destruction of the current system. They are calls for action. And this is very similar to what we see with the far right posters as well. They're not obscuring violence. Instead, they appear to be glorifying violence, which seems to be a strange strategy, you know, to recruit from the general public. More, it seems to be a form of intimidation used against the outgroup, not just fascists, but people who are part of the capitalist system and government, people who support it as well. It's a statement of bravado, a statement of threat, a statement really of war even. We also see the strong appeal of nostalgia and popular youth culture, particularly the youth culture of the 80s and the 90s. You know, if these posters are produced for the general public, then one of their functions appears to be seeding ideas in the public's mind, you know, ideas about revolution, ideas about change. And in this way, they're designed in a very retrograde, nostalgic manner to appeal to either the middle-aged or to young people who are attracted to the retro style. Images can refer back to the innocence of childhood, you know, when compared to the complexities and difficulties of contemporary life. And this is certainly a strategy that people have seen online through meme culture and so on. And that's my final point, really, that this radical left postering appears to be reflecting meme culture offline, but in a retrograde, old school sort of fashion. Images have a penchant for humor, satirical interpretation, for irony, for referencing. They're more akin to what we might, you know, expect to see on fringe internet platforms and image boards like 4chan or 8chan or Reddit or something like that. So the posters and stickers are an offline example of online activity. And it's an example that's really flourishing offline during the COVID period and the pandemic period. And it's one that I think is, you know, worthy of a lot more study in future. So I'll end there. I hope that you enjoyed the images. It was interesting. And I'll pass over now to Sarah for the third presentation.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you, Mario and Julian. So today, Antifa and anti-fascists have been referred to in both of the previous presentations that we've had today, and they've been conceptualized in the greater radical left. So I'll be talking about some initial empirical findings from a research study into the Australian Antifa Facebook accounts. So the aim of this study is to identify dominant themes and narratives used by the Australian-based Antifa groups on Facebook, explore what role the global issues play, and how these are adapted to the local context here in Australia. The study is part of broader research, and it also includes accounts based in the UK that cross over both Facebook and Twitter, and also includes US accounts based on Twitter. The broader sample is 30 accounts, but the Australian sample looks at 10 accounts situated in 4 states along the eastern side of Australia. We're looking at almost 2,000 posts between February and June in 2019, and also the corresponding period in 2020. So when I refer to Antifa, what do I mean? It's a term that's used widely in media, and it's an important term to define in the context of the study. Antifa, the term, is historically derived from Germany, from anti-fascist action, though the groups today are not, and particularly in Australia, are not politically linked to the groups from back then. Antifa is a contraction term of anti-fascist, and while it sounds quite simple, there are a number of definitions of Antifa and no unanimously agreed definition. To separate Antifa from the broader anti-fascist movement, I use a definition which describes these groups as formal anti-fascist groups, or what are called militant anti-fascists. And in this context, it's important to understand that the term militant does not necessarily equate to the use of violence. militant groups do endorse the use of direct action, which is described as cutting out the middleman. It means solving problems for yourself rather than relying on authorities or external institutions to step in and do it for you. Direct action against fascists includes a range of tactics, and it includes physical confrontation. But importantly, it's not the only option, and it's not necessarily the first option. And this links back to some of the points that Mario raised earlier. A key differential between militant Antifa and the more liberal anti-fascist groups is that the militant groups will not work with government and the police to oppose fascists and fascist mobilization, while more liberal groups will. So the more liberal groups might include non-government organisations or charities in this space. As has been mentioned earlier, so Antifa will draw from the broader radical left and will include autonomous anarchists, anti-authoritarians, left libertarians, communist and socialist views. So importantly, they are non-partisan in their approach to opposing fascism. I guess what this means is that in the broader radical left, where there might be some conflicts between political views, within Antifa, the common aim of fighting fascists and fascism takes precedence to any conflicts that occur. It's evident in the online space where you'll see statements such as, "This is non-sectarian defence. We may have beef outside the protest, but in the streets we stand shoulder to shoulder. We protect each other and we have each other's back." And there have been attempts to define Antifa as a terrorist organisation in the US. Donald Trump famously tweeted about this during his presidency. And despite this, Antifa are better described as a transnational social movement rather than an organisation. Social movements and networks of individuals and groups that have common identities and might use unconventional means. And Antifa themselves are probably more like affinity groups. They don't adopt a formal hierarchy or generally a centralised structure that would be indicative of an organisation. In the context of Australia, we see the loose networked approach online where there are localised chapters or profiles that are often named by their geographic location. We see groups named Antifa Australia, Anti-Fascist Action Melbourne, and Anti-Fascist Action Sydney. And while these groups are identified as geographically separate, the network links, the collective identity, and the shared culture are evident online through the sharing of posts, events, and imagery from other groups in Australia and also overseas. So findings from the study indicate that the Australian Antifa groups, while demonstrating their specific local identity, do situate themselves within the global anti-fascist movement. They adopt the common icons, the symbols, and the themes that dominate the global movement worldwide. In particular, as you can expect, there is an opposition to fascism and the far right, to the government and the police. But we also see an advocacy for minority groups, particularly for Indigenous issues and Indigenous rights. The naming conventions highlighted a moment ago, where a local chapter is linked to their geographic location, is a practice adopted globally and is historically informed by German groups and later the UK-based groups in the 1980s, who also adopted this convention, and we've seen that continue around the world. We can see here that the Australian Antifa iconography is adaptive. The adaptations often draw from international history going back to pre-war foundations, as well as the Australian national themes that you can see on the screen. They use local visual symbols and the popular iconography, often referred to as culture jamming, and what Julian referred to as a moment where you see the popular cartoons and imagery adapted and used to reach out broadly. We can see the choice of symbols that they use is quite innovative. In two instances here, the two flags which traditionally are associated with Antifa iconography are placed with red and black computers. And you can also see an image of a guillotine there. The adaptive and the dynamic use of the icons highlights the diverse ideologies that we see, the groups and the spaces that make up the Antifa movement in Australia, while also maintaining the visual cues that we see symbolic of and identify with the global Antifa movement. Looking at the icons here, you can see a subset from the sample population, and you can see the adaptations of the traditional icons used in the social media profiles. The blue Eureka flag that you can see here has its origins in the Eureka Rebellion against British colonial authority in Victoria, in the gold mining town of Ballarat. This symbol is associated with the Australian Union movement, traditions of resistance, democracy and protest. And the use of this flag in the context of Melbourne Anti-Fascist Info also resonates not only with its geographic base in Victoria, but with the group's advocacy for workers' rights, the strong union, and the importance of developing a united working class. The computers, for example, align with the goals of groups and their focus on digital activism to inform the public about fascism. And this can be quite relevant in Tasmania, where there wouldn't be as many street protests that you'd imagine compared to somewhere like Victoria or New South Wales. Anti-fascist actions, Albury and Wodonga, you can see they've adopted the guillotine symbol. And this is associated with the French Revolution and particularly reflects the group's focus on opposing the government. And lastly, the symbol on the right for Antifa Australia, they've adopted the laurel wreath and the gears representing both a working class orientation and a subcultural leaning. So it's through this use of the different icons that you can see the real distinct cultures and identities of these groups come out and their connection with the global movement. So the linkages between the themes which emerged in the study provide some great insight into the issues that inform their online narratives. While there are dominant themes that emerge, they are also linked together in a narrative that is relatively consistent across the groups. Not surprisingly, a focus on the far right, fascist, white supremacist, and nationalist ideology was prominent. And we often see that there's a criticism of Antifa in that they have a broad brush approach to classifying fascists. And what is evident from the Australian groups is there is a level of consistency in those that they class as fascists, the far right or white supremacists, and though these terms might be used interchangeably. Over 20% of the posts identified through the study included posts that referred to groups such as these, and they focus specifically on the individuals and the groups in Australia and internationally. Looking at the terms that they use to describe them, they refer to them as cowards, germs, scum, and thugs. And importantly, the international threat in US, Bulgaria, and Ukraine is also highlighted to reinforce the international and the evolving threat posed by the right elsewhere, and to bring that into the Australian local context. You can see on that image on the screen there that you've got a couple of Australian identities also combined with some from the UK, calling them cardboard gangsters, again, in a way to delegitimise the actors that we see in the outgroup. The focus on the far right also highlights the links that we see between not only these groups and individuals, but also the state, the government, and the police in what Antifa describe as a three-way fight. Anarchist and anti-authoritarian views are often associated with Antifa. Anarchism is visually represented through movement iconology by the black flag in the traditional two flags that usually has one red and one black. And what we can see is opposition to the state is really evident within this sample, with Antifa viewing the state as something that cannot be relied on by anti-fascists, particularly when it comes to protecting minority groups from the right or fascists. Politicians such as Peter Dutton, Pauline Hanson, Fraser Renning are also highlighted as representing a political system that's complicit in and enabling the wider systemic injustices and oppression. In addition, we see One Nation and Clive Palmer's Australia First Party often highlighting the racist nature of these parties in the political system. One thing we also see is the legitimacy of the government is called into questions, with reference to so-called Australian government. Despite this, opposition to and direct action against the political establishment is often demonstrated online with posts showing campaign flyers being burnt, signs being vandalised, and these more lower level acts rather than through specific calls for violence or threats. Opposition to police as representatives of the state is expressed frequently and was often raised in the context of the mistreatment of minority groups, particularly Indigenous individuals in their communities. Some of these examples seen across each of the accounts included the Australian Black Lives Matter protests, which focused on Indigenous deaths in custody, and the police removal of the traditional custodians from their lands, which was a common local adaptation of the broader global narrative. We can see structural issues of racism, Australia's history of colonisation, and the ongoing colonisation of Indigenous communities and targeting by the state, which was a theme which was specific to the local context here in Australia and the history that we have. What we saw were calls to action to support the preservation of Indigenous spaces from development, including the celebration of and victories when police tried to remove people from spaces represented as the colonising forces. We see a continuation of the narrative to support Indigenous communities in their fight against the state and their continued efforts against colonisation, which is again the localisation of the global Black Lives Matter campaign here. As Julian mentioned, with imagery in the public spaces, when COVID emerged and in 2020, it had a significant influence on the posting activities of the groups. We saw an overall decrease in the number of posts that were seen during this period compared to 2019. And the analysis that we conducted demonstrated that posts referring to the pandemic were commonly linked to opposition to the government and police, such as power overreach, anti-capitalism, but importantly, solidarity with working class people who were particularly affected by the pandemic and the existence of structural racism in Australia. What we saw in this way, that the pandemic was used to emphasise the existing global narratives rather than prompting discussions of new ideas. Peter Dutton was a prominent feature in the images that you see posted online. And the references again, when he got COVID, sending him to Christmas Island, which is the example of his link to refugees and the role he plays in that space. We see the reference to police as filthy carriers. And then again, the anti-government and don't gather in groups unless you've got enough people to overthrow. So that's, I guess, looking at the roles that the restrictions play compared to police there. And lastly, one of the themes that emerged was, despite calls globally to nominate Antifa as a terrorist organisation and widely being reported and associated with violent protest, explicit calls for violence were absent in the dataset. And this resonates with previous studies conducted into Australia's far left online and also recent US studies, which highlighted Antifa's rhetorical restraint that they use when it comes to the literal and rhetorical use of violence, both in the street and in online spaces. This contrasts with the widespread association of Antifa and their approach to direct action with violence, an association that is academically and empirically contested. What was evident is that rather than call explicit calls for violence, there was an importance placed on community organising and mobilisation and support through protest to bring about social change, and the importance placed on creating more self-reliant communities. This was illustrated by a 2019 post that you can see there from Antifa Australia, which states, "Dangerous conservative extremists threaten innocent people. Defend our community from violence-minded conservatives. Defeat the bigoted hate groups through people's protest and organising." This approach challenges the conceptualisation of Antifa as purely violent and reactive. And so it just highlights, I guess, the lack of violent narratives that were found across the data set, and that real focus on creating those self-reliant communities. And I guess linking back to some of the points that Julian raised is we see images there that talk about solidarity and the reliance on building a strong community, but there is a minority of phrases, symbols and means that have that more militant and violent approach. So that is very much still aligned with the Antifa culture, that might not be as prominent as what you would expect when you're looking at the Australian group. So I guess what can we conclude from this analysis? Preliminary insights indicate that the importance local context plays for Antifa groups here in Australia, though they also maintain that connection to the global movement. The connection is visually evident through the use of the icons, the two flags, and the symbolic phrases such as smash fascism that you see there. And these all help to form the collective identity that we see is Antifa. And finally, the existence of global narratives are evident with the imminent threat of the far right and the corrupt nature of the state, which are used to mobilise solidarity with minority groups and particularly Indigenous groups here in Australia. Thank you. And I guess that's the end of our presentations. I will stop sharing and then we can open up for questions.
Brilliant. Mario, how would you like to do it? Should we go through the questions from the top down?
Yeah, good. Some of them are quite connected. So I think, so thanks for the questions. They're really good questions. Like them. And, maybe I start with the first one then. I think the first one is relates to my presentation a bit more, and then we can go to the next. Is okay?
Yep.
So the first question from Amy is, what evidence is there that the radical left, sorry, is this the first one? Or whether they're extremist, what evidence is they're extremist, and what evidence is there that it's organized? So a bit of two questions. I try to be brief. I avoid the term extremist because I think it doesn't really apply. There are different terminologies that are used. I usually differentiate between radical and extreme. Both together are the far left. That's how I see, and that's drawing from literature. And the difference is that an extreme group, an extremist group, would reject the democratic principles. And I would say that the radical, or let's say, broadly speaking, the far left in Australia does not reject the democratic principles, but pushes it to an extreme, in a way, to use the word extreme. So in that sense, I would not use the word extreme for the far left. And I tend to say, I prefer to say the radical left, because that's more accurate from my, but there are different terminologies. Organized, it sounds a bit like there's this perception that the right is more organized than the left, and I wouldn't say that that's the case. Maybe that's because of the fact that we often don't know enough about, there's no research about the far left, or hardly anything, and we present it now, but the radical left is very, very well organized. I mean, apart from actual party structures, which I'm not really want to talk too much about it, but there is communist parties, but they have bookshops, they have academic journals, the Marxist Review, they have Red Flag is a very central newspaper that is organized by the Socialist Alliance, which is the by far biggest and best organized group. They're often organized through student groups at almost every university. There's Socialist Alternative. There's an International Socialist Alliance, which is less prominent. So that's a very, very firmly organized group. They have regular meetings, they know each other, you can go there. It's quite open, actually, usually. Antifa is different, and Antifa is, as Sarah said, differently organized because it's not an organization as such. But there's a high level of organization within socialist radical left movements in Australia, I would say. That's sort of my short comment on the organizational level. I hope that it was answered the question. Okay.
Right. Do you want me to go to the next one then, Mario, where there's a question by Sahar that asked about the implications of research presented by me that compares the far left and the far right, but also brings about the really important question around doing this research under a security discourse, with words like extremism, threat, radicalization, and so on. I think that also relates to that broader question that's coming through a lot around what is extremism and radicalism. Yeah, great question. And so I guess what I would say, I would agree with you, Mario, that we need to distinguish between that which is radical and that which is extreme. I think we're all radicals in some way or another, and there's nothing, sounds patronizing, there's nothing wrong with radical politics, of course. Extremism, as you say, Mario, is an attempt to undermine the democratic state or the way that politics is practiced in Australia at the moment. And extremists of all sorts, try to do that in one way or another. My presentation was on street art, and the real problem and danger in that presentation, which I have to make very clear, is conflating it all together. Like, as I said, most of that art is not depicted with a statement of an intent, nor is it depicted who did the art. So it's hard to know, right? Is it extremist? Is it radical? Or is it just issues based, like, smash the patriarchy, or Black Lives Matter, or something like that. So, I don't want to give the audience the impression that I'm conflating it all together and saying it's all extremist. I'm not. I'm looking at that sample and trying to tease out the themes that are there. I would say, though, that if you are using either revolutionary Marxist or revolutionary anarchist symbolism, then whether you know it or not, you're an extremist, because we can't forget the 20th century. I'm not talking about socialism or Marxism generally, but revolutionary Marxism and revolutionary anarchism are both extremist forms of extremism. Are they threats? Yeah, they are absolutely threats. And if you, a cursory look at 20th century politics will show you just how big a threats they can be. But I'm not claiming that all that street art was done by revolutionary Marxists or revolutionary anarchists, but we do see that symbolism, in there in places. We also see, a play on language, right? So people use words like smash the patriarchy, or axe the rich. Is that just a way of rhetorically undermining the force of the argument, or is it the use of violent language to insinuate violence, right? I can't say, right? But I certainly wouldn't write on it or publish on it from a security frame, just taking every reference to smash or axe as a declaration of intent to violence. I think that would be, oversimplifying. And coming back to your point, Saha, that would also be bringing in a securitization lens, and even, we even see a counterterrorism lens applied to this sort of material. And that's not always appropriate. We have to remember, most terrorist organizations in the 20th century were leftist. We can't be blind, I don't think, to the history here. However, we also have to be very careful, in how we talk about this and how we frame it. Radical politics is important. Even if you don't agree with radical politics, it's important because it moves the discussion and dialogue in our societies, in new directions. And a securitization lens and language can blunt that and make it seem like being a radical is somehow, illegitimate or illegal. I never want to do that. But again, just to reinforce, I think we have to be very clear-minded about what extremism is and when it is a threat to the state. So I'll stop there on that answer.
There was one question to give Sarah a chance to also answer some of the questions. There was one question about the Antifa in the US, whether we can. Sarah, are you?
Yeah, so a sample of the US study. So there was a recent study, and I can, I'm not sure what the best way to make that available would be, whether it's giving it to Grace for the contact, but it was by Marilyn Copesy, the role of rhetorical restraint. It was recently published in Perspectives on Terrorism, and talks about the different strategies adopted in this space.
So I mean, you've done the work on Antifa, but I mean, from my understanding, the misconception of Australian Antifa stems often from watching what unfolds in the US, and we talk about very different, well connected, ideologically connected, but operationally quite different things.
Right. Yeah.
So also the threat level is sorry.
No, I was going to say, and part of the broader study that I'm doing is looking at a bit of a transnational analysis between the US, the UK, and Australia, just to understand those differences so that we don't draw those comparisons between how the groups operate in different countries, and understand the role that local context does play in how the groups operate.
I might jump to that question about Black Lives Matter, whether it's radical. And I mean, it's a big question. What do we even describe as radical? And there were a few things that shouldn't it be everyone's business to cover fascist stickers and things like that? It's a big, I would not consider the Black Lives Matter movement to be radical at all. And I hope it didn't come across as such. Social justice, progressive movements are just, part of parcel of I wouldn't consider that radical. But what I was trying to say was that groups that emerged in the context, or networks that emerged, socialist groups didn't emerge in the context, but networks like CARR that emerged in the context of the rise of the far right in the mid-2010s, they are here now, and they find new areas to contribute to, and they deliberately look for playing a supporting act in those progressive movements. So they are not. That doesn't make Black Lives Matter or Black Deaths in Custody a radical movement just because there's a socialist presence or an anarchist presence that supports them. Rather the opposite. And what CARR and many socialist movements want to move away from is putting us into these boxes of radical or not radical. They would like to move somewhere where it's not radical to be anti-capitalist and to be, to stand up for the oppressed, very broadly speaking, and for the marginalized. So that's they don't want to be radical, but at this point in time, the argument would be the system is shaped by capitalist thinking, neoliberal thinking, and you have to be radical in order to counter that. And you do that in many different ways. And in that sense, environmental activism can be driven by socialist ideas. I mean, we have seen, there was a picture in my presentation. The fight against, or the fight for climate or against climate change is a fight against capitalism, the way it is framed. So it's all connected to that. But I just wanted to say that Black Lives Matter is not radical, and covering fascist sticker is not the sole task of anti-fascist groups. Maybe anyone, Julian, if you want to jump in there.
No, I agree completely, Mario. I wouldn't consider Black Lives Matter to be radical nor extreme. I don't think that's the case at all. I guess the thing that I found surprising was the violence of the imagery when we studied it, in that it is quite different to the interviews that you do with members of these organizations, or as Sarah showed, the material on the online Facebook sites and so on, which is more moderate, more circumspect, and also more focused on what they want to create, which is a social justice, infused social and political system. So it's positive, right? And I guess, it was interesting when we analyzed the material of on the streets, in that it's much more violent. And so, does that mean that there are different groups that are putting the material up on the streets that are more violently inclined or more revolutionarily inclined? Or, and this I would be more supportive of the second perspective, does it mean that the street art serves a different purpose, right? Is it a bit like putting up images that are attempting to warn off your foes, as statements of intents against fascists, or against the limbs of the state that they would say support fascism, like the police and so on, and if you look at the anthropology of imagery and art, violence is much more embedded in imagery than is in real life, right? Most cultures will put up imagery of violent people and pictures and so on to ward off enemies and so on. It's a common human trait, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily running around perpetrating violence, so we can't read the imagery as a statement of intent for violence. I think that's really, really important. And there's a lot more questions, I think, raised by this research than answers at the moment. And the audience are asking the right sorts of questions, and they're very difficult to answer. It's a very diverse movement. Sarah, have you any thoughts on that?
No, I there's nothing really that I can add. That I think you two have both summed it up quite nicely.
There's one big question, sort of a bit almost the elephant in the room, that terrorism claims, that I think we should address that, so we don't appear like we want to avoid that. I just want to quickly respond to John Hurst's question around Black Lives Matter and radicalism. I would not say that Black Lives Matter is sort of the continuation or sort of a new installment of Black Panther and Black Power movement. I think it's more the civil rights movement that we see there, and not a radical movement to demand changes to do something about death in custody. But I mean, that's a complicated question. I don't want to brush it off, and I apologize if I don't give it the depth and the time that it deserves, that kind of question. Happy to do that offline, then if you contact me or us. The big question is that Matthew, I think, asked that, is it unstructured? Is this a form of unstructured terrorism? There's an article about this, and there were times in Australian history when academics came to the conclusion that certain periods, very short period, Julian helped me there, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, short periods of far-right radical extremist, left-wing extremists did fall under that label. It's debatable, but there are academics that would say that. today I don't see any indication that there is a terrorist threat, or that we could see the radical left as a form of unstructured terrorism. Even in the US, there's a big debate. I mean, obviously, in the US, there's a big debate about this. And even terrorism researchers and academics, even in the US, came to the conclusion that it's not, should not be considered a form of terrorism or terrorist organization, applying the typical definitions. But even less so in Australia, where we basically have no violence. What I really find interesting is the violent talk or rhetoric on posters, or, you know, is really is an important element of the self-definition, but it's not defining any behavior. So I spoke to people who said the far right, they deserve the fist of the anti-fascist fist. And it was this young woman who probably, and never used that fist. It is just part of a narrative. And a bit like this picture that I showed before, seeing themselves as being ready to defend and ready to strike, but never strike. That sort of reflects, a bit simplistically, but that sort of reflects the nature at the moment here. And working with progressive groups, with many other non-radical, non-ideologically defined groups, is sort of where the radical left in Australia has been in a while. What we saw is occasional clashes on the street, when they escalate, sort of pushing someone's cap off, and then a bit of, I mean, that did happen, and there were fights, but that was situational, and apart from that, it didn't happen.
Yeah, I'll throw in Mario there as well, and just add that we use the word terrorism way too much at the moment, and we have ever since 9/11, and it's just increasing at the moment with radical and groups on the left and the right being called terrorists. You know, terrorism is a terrible word to use for extremists or people whose politics we don't like, because it loses all analytical meaning. Terrorism is a word used to describe a political revolutionary movement that engages in state violence against the state, that either engages in that violence or threatens that violence, you know, in a serious and real way, in an attempt usually to overthrow a state, or at least to leverage that state in some way. You know, and when you call the radical left or the radical right terrorists, you know, I think that really what you're doing is you're conflating, you know, two very different processes. And it's dangerous because you're also conflating how you deal with them, right? You deal with terrorists through a national security apparatus, you know, intelligence policing, you know, being able to stop the terrorist members and the cells from operating. You don't stop a broad political movement like that, you know, if you wanted to stop it, right? I'm not saying you necessarily do, but, you know, so I don't think we should be calling the radical left or even the extreme left terrorists. I don't actually think we should be calling the extreme right terrorists either. I think we should be calling them a threat. You know, they are a threat, but are they a terror threat? Not really. They're a different threat. They're a threat to democracy, a threat to the norms and principles, you know, that we hold, you know, in Australia, you know, as the basis for our social and political system. You know, as Mario said, you know, there were movements, terror movements in the 20th century, you know, the late 1960s, the new wave terrorists, you know, in the US and in Australia, the Weather Underground and Amanda Meinhof gang and so on, the Red Brigades, that were student-based leftist terror groups that engaged in violent acts against the general public, you know, and did so with the strategy of undermining society, bringing about a revolution. But we don't see the radical left or the extreme left doing that today. You know, they're not, as far as anyone can tell, as far as I can tell, engaging in plots to do violence against the general public, you know, to abduct and kill bankers or to blow up public spaces. You know, so I really think it's wrong to think about this in terrorist terms. It doesn't help the issues at all. You know, and that goes for the far right, you know, as well. I mean, the imagery that I showed of violent images associated with leftist politics, I don't consider them to be calls for real world violence. So I don't consider them to be terrorist agitation for terrorist actions by the left. However, you know, I can promise you that if I saw a similar imagery from a far right neo-Nazi group, I probably would interpret it you know, as having potential for real world violence on the street. You know, and so I have to think about why the difference is there. You know, is the difference because my politics is more you know, drawn to the left and the right, or is the difference because, you know, there is a real difference, you know, in how these groups operate? And I think there is. You know, we've seen that far right groups, neo-Nazi groups, are more drawn, you know, to violence against the general public and violence against people, you know, than the radical left is. So it's very hard to give simple answers. It's a very complicated area, but I really think the less we talk about terrorism, the better in this space, because it doesn't help. It usually just hinders our analysis of what's going on. But Sarah, you might have some thoughts on that.
I just wanted to quickly throw in the comment that Sarah, not you, Sarah, but someone in the audience made. We have seen how far-right ideologies influenced the terrorist activity in Christchurch. So there is obviously, of course, there is a connection, and that is obviously terrorism. Sorry, I didn't want to. Just wanted to mention it because it seems important. So, other Sarah Holmes.
Now, I can address a question on here in relation to do we know how big the Antifa presence is in Australia, and are there any formal anti-fascist groups? And I guess one of the issues I found with when we were looking at my research was how to actually engage with these groups and get the access. And it's a hard to reach population from that perspective, and doing it on the digital and the online space gives a bit better access to the material. In terms of the presence in Australia, it's hard to gauge. We do see in the material actions that there's the stickering, or I guess the actions that were taken in the real life space, but it is hard to put a number on what the scale of the presence of Antifa here in Australia would be. I'm not sure if you've got anything from your experience down in Melbourne, Mario, that you want to add.
No, I wouldn't be able to quantify.
Yeah.
As a question, is there evidence of far left groups attempting to infiltrate and shift the policy of mainstream political parties in the same way we have seen the far right attempt in New South Wales? I might say share a few thoughts. We have socialist alternative we have socialist parties, so they participate. I find that, and that is a contested way of political activism within the radical left, because others would say we don't engage in party politics because it's part of the system that we actually want to bring down, because it's as one of the posters that I think Julian showed, if you vote, what you get is a politician, and that's not what you want. Julian, isn't that one poster? So some people reject that electoral system, parliamentarian, to engage in that system. But then you also have others that are a bit more pragmatic, but they're still revolutionary socialists. And I've always found that there's a bit of a tension there, that you are revolutionary socialists believing in prefigurative politics, but at the same time, you engage in especially local elections. So you could say that's a bit incoherent, because basically you're participating in a system that you don't fully believe in that kind of democratic system, but it does exist. Active in the unions. Unions is another example, and I'm not saying that all unions are necessarily now always, defined by socialist ideologies or Marxist ideologies, but some are more left-leaning and some are openly socialists. So I think that there's less of a need to infiltrate. There's a reluctance to infiltrate because from the radical elements, it's a reluctance because you actually don't want to engage with that system and you don't want to participate in that system. And then there are other sort of established pathways of using mainstream politics already that are not secretive or hidden. It's quite open, and you can vote for socialist alternatives. The socialists, so it's not socialist alternatives, that's not a party, but socialists, Victorian socialists, for example.
Mario, Greg's put up a great comment, I think, as well. He's responding to what I said before around, the overuse of the term terrorism. But he's made the point that in terms of the far right, you certainly cannot say that the far right is not terroristic in the US, and that the Christchurch attack shows that far-right terrorism has certainly arrived in Australia. You know, the perpetrator, of course, coming from New South Wales. You know, and Greg, you know, I think you're absolutely right. You're adding another layer to this discussion. You know, and I think that what we might be seeing there, and I'm really just throwing out some ideas here that I think about, is that when you look at far-right violence and othering, they other whole populations, you know, people who are not white, people who are immigrants, people who are Jews, people who are Muslims, and so on, and they create a visual hatred around that, and that can lead to these active shooters and active violent individuals, you know, acting on behalf of these conspiracy theories that they push. Somehow, you know, and maybe we can have a discussion about how and why it's different with the far left. You know, they certainly other the government and so on, and push for change, even revolutionary change, but they don't seem to do so in a way that creates active shooters or individuals who act out on behalf of this, you know, in shopping malls or banks or public buildings. You know, and I don't quite know where that difference is right now, but it's definitely there. And it's a really important difference to make. You know, I would, just because I'm saying the far right aren't formally or technically terrorist groups in Australia at the moment, it doesn't mean they're not a threat. You know, they are a threat. I think that they're a very big threat as well. But yeah, so thank you for the comment, Greg.
Sort of coming to an field. I apologize if we haven't really responded to all the questions, given them the attention that they deserve, but I think it's getting a bit overwhelmed by all the different comments and questions, to be honest. Sorry. Yeah. I'm not sure whether we should leave it at that, or is there? Have you seen anything? Any questions that just to come? Oh, we have a Dayton shooter had an extreme left Twitter feed. He had a very mixed Twitter feed, I would say. It was a bit all over the place, but I mean, I don't know enough about that to comment. I mean, there's left wing, there's radical left violence in other parts of the world that are problematic, but we haven't seen anything even vaguely similar to that in Australia. So I understand that. I mean, I'm from Germany, so I follow that conversation in Germany a little bit. There are groups that go out and really almost like bash and almost kill people from that they consider to be like Trump supporters, or in groups from like far-right groups that exist. We have always had an autonomous anarchist movement in Germany where they firebomb cars, destroy big BMWs and Mercedes-Benz and Porsche and so forth. I'm not downplaying that risk and that problem that it does exist within the radical and then extreme left, but not in Australia. We just haven't seen anything. It goes to that point where anarchist groups go to a fascist, openly fascist supporter, like a shop, and smash a window. That's the extent. That's rare, but it does happen. That's the extent, but it's very low key, and it targets not, it doesn't create fear in populations. It creates fear in a very, very small group, or that's the intention at least. So I'm not saying that's not problematic. The use of violence always is, or when we remember how Andrew Bolt, I think, was attacked, or a pathetic attempt of an attack, because I think he hit back and is almost won that boxing fight. But I mean, these are situational, small scale escalations of very, very small number of, and we haven't seen that in recent years, actually. It's something that happened then. So I'm not downplaying that risk, but it's on a very different scale. I can just say, if someone wants to continue conversation, then I mean, feel free to reach out to me, and we can see how we can continue that. But I'm glad that we had a chance, and I'm grateful for everyone for the time that we had a chance to talk about empirical stuff. And I would like to continue that sort of empirically evidence-based discussion around Antifa. And I hope that we don't fall back into, look what happened in the US, and compare left and right all the time, because I think that this could be a good start for that rethinking of that space. just sort of like a spontaneous response from me at the end to conclude.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to second that, Mario. I think it's been a fantastic session, and thank you for all the questions. And hopefully it's the beginning of a lot more, empirical research in this space, and a lot more discussion as well. As we've seen, the discussion's only really just begun, and there's a lot of angles that need to be talked about, a lot of research needs to be done. And if anybody does want to contact me at Macquarie University, they can do so to continue the discussion going forward.
I can echo those sentiments as well. Looking forward to exploring the role of Antifa in Australia, and just looking at it empirically based and looking at the different nuances so we don't conflate the broader movement with what we see here in Australia.
Maybe I have to put my quiz hat on for a moment because no one else can. So I thank Chris for the opportunity to have this webinar, and I also thank everyone on behalf of Chris at the same time that you made it today, and that you asked us questions. And so thanks for that. It was after all a quiz webinar.